we're sort of talking about critical thinking today, and basically critical thinking, really the first most important thing really is to understand what your original thoughts are. So if you're given a question, actually take note of what you think immediately. So we do tend to have an opinion, so it's good to get that down in writing, because if we're not aware of our own initial position, it may bias us. So critical thinking involves us collecting up the evidence, and when we're collecting up the evidence, we need to be able to identify other people's arguments. So what are they trying to persuade me of? Okay, so if I'm not aware of what I originally think, it's going to be harder for me to, I might be biased. I might only look at research that fits in with what I originally think, but I may not know that that bias within me is driving my research. But I also need to identify what they're trying to persuade me of, because everybody has a position. So we know in newspapers that the journalist will put a slant on it. Well, this also happens with academic writing. So we need to be able to identify what other people are trying to persuade us of. And we do that by looking at the techniques they use. What sort of language are they using? What's their rhetoric? What sort of metaphors are they using? And we weigh up the evidence. So if we know what we think, it means that we look at all the evidence and we critically assess it. So even if it's in line with what I think, I also need to look at whether the methodology was good. I don't just assume that because it fits in with what I originally thought when I arrived at the topic, that I can just accept that at face value. I need to assess the reasoning, the logic, the methodology for each piece of evidence, and so I weigh that up and evaluate it with a view to making a final judgment. So it's like being a detective. You collect the evidence. You don't decide before you arrive at the crime scene who committed the crime. You go in with an open mind and you collect up all the evidence, and you make sure your evidence covers the whole spectrum, and you make sure that it's good evidence, that it hasn't been tainted. So that detective analogy is a good one for critical thinking, I think. And then once we've actually evaluated all this evidence, it's then a case of we actually have to make a judgment, because academic writing is not descriptive, we're not writing narratives, we are actually making a case for something, whether it's the sciences or the arts. So if it's an essay, you've got a thesis statement. If it's a journal article, you're going to be arguing for a certain explanation for your results. So this weighing up the evidence and actually making a case, at this point you're sort of shifting from detective to judge. Okay, so as the judge, you once again don't bring bias into it. So you are looking at this evidence in the most unbiased way possible, and then making a judgment and then presenting your judgment. Okay, so knowing our own position, knowing other people's positions, evaluating the evidence, making the judgment. That's actually critical thinking in a nutshell.